As the 10-year anniversary of 9/11 is approaching and all attention is being paid to this event, I was talking to someone who was a Holocaust survivor, and his reaction was really one of some anger, actually, in all the attention that had been paid to 9/11, and with a bit of resentment said, well, the Holocaust, I mean, that was Shoah, that was something so much more tragedy, such a greater tragedy, and so little attention is being paid to that today relative to this event. Of course, we have to agree with that sentiment. It's true. But nonetheless, the events of 9/11 are quite a significant event for our generation, for all of us who witnessed it and lived through it. And I think it has significance, great significance for us as Americans and us as American Jews. This is certainly true in terms of the human tragedy, in terms of the political and historical significance of the event. In a few brief moments, thousands of people died in most horrific circumstances. We also have to remember the firefighters, the police, the emergency workers, and the other heroes who, without hesitation, ran into the burning buildings to save others. Most significantly, in the few brief moments, the worldview of our country changed, and our daily lives continue to be affected by the event. We as Jews and familiar with Israel, we don't have to explain to our fellow Americans any longer what life is like, to be accustomed to waiting on security checks, to thinking about every abandoned package being a potentially dangerous item, to explain what a chefetz chashud is. We wait on long security lines. We're checked before we go into buildings. We see signs in the subway to remind us to keep alert, to look for suspicious packages. We struggle with the balance between personal freedoms and the need to have electronic surveillance and enhanced interrogation techniques. Sadly, this new reality hasn't brought us, all of Americans, in complete and universal alliance with Israel. But I think it has brought the two countries together and sharing some of the same reality. While a lot can be said about these events from a historical perspective, from a political perspective, I don't think this is the forum to do so. Instead, I want to touch briefly on the human aspect of the tragedy and how such an event could affect us all on a personal level. No doubt everyone in this room can remember where he or she was that morning on September 11th, 2001. I know there are people in this room who worked in or around the World Trade Center. I know people who were close by to the area that day. There are those who had relatives or friends who worked in the World Trade Center or the Pentagon, I shouldn't neglect that as well, and were touched directly by the tragedy. There are those in the community who were among the first responders, who ran to the building, into the building to save them. Thank God they are well. And everyone in this room witnessed the event, live. Whether you were in Midtown Manhattan or watching it on television, I have no doubt that no one was not touched personally by the events of that day and the enormity of the event of that day. What does it mean for us to have been personally touched by this catastrophe? We read about war, we read about terrorism, we read about famine, we read about disease, we read about natural disasters, but Baruch Hashem, for the most part here in New Rochelle, these are remote and distant events, not connected to our daily lives. When we hear about these events, we try to connect to them on a humanitarian level. When it's Israel involved, we have a better ability to do so. But even so, it's still, as we sit here in New Rochelle and in America, it's hard for us to connect to these types of events on a human level. In my case, I was very close to the World Trade Center that day. My office was at 1 Liberty Plaza, which was the black building you saw just adjacent to the Trade Center, just across the street from the South Tower of the World Trade Center. There were some 50,000 people who worked in the World Trade Center, who had offices in the Trade Center. There were probably 5 or 10 times that many people passed through those buildings every single day. Like everybody who worked in downtown Manhattan, I passed through those buildings every day as they were on the train into work. Or shopped in the plaza, shopped in the shopping plaza below the buildings. That particular day, I wasn't taking the train. It was actually one of the first times I had ever driven into work. I had moved to New Rochelle only recently. My father-in-law's birthday was that day. We were taking him out to dinner, so I decided to drive him to work. And as it turned out, not knowing the routes very well from New Rochelle, whereas I was aiming to get to Lower Manhattan and park where I normally would park on the times that I drove in, just near the Trade Center, I got a little confused on the roads and ended up instead on the east side, just as the second plane hit the South Tower. And at 10 o'clock, and having done so, whereas my colleagues in my building, we were on the 40th floor, had about as close a view as you could have to the event. They had evacuated the area immediately. I, having driven into the area, was walking towards the building, not realizing what had happened. So at 10 o'clock, I found myself standing on Broadway. Met a few people from my office, and we were trying to decide where to go. We were standing with, I must admit, some detachment. This was still very far away. The building was burning, but it was so high up. It was so far away. Things were falling off the building, which we took to be debris, but we know now it was people jumping. At 10 a.m., we decided about time for us to leave the area. We turned around, and suddenly we heard a huge explosion, and we ran. You saw in the cloud, you saw in the film presentation, the cloud that came down the street and the building fell. It wasn't a cloud. It had physical presence. It was debris. And I ran down the street and ducked into a sandwich shop, and I watched that cloud go by the window, like a physical being going by. It was a very surreal thing to look out the window and see that. We didn't know what exactly was happening. I remember some people were holding the door closed, not wanting anything to get in because we didn't really know what exactly was happening there. And a man came up to the window, like in a movie, covered in this gray snow. People didn't want to let him in. We convinced them they had to let him in. And then most amazingly, when the dust started settling, there was a man who I'll never know who he is, but he immediately ran outside. He immediately ran into this strange, surreal environment, yelled out, "Anyone need help?" I couldn't believe it. When it cleared a bit and we left the room, left the store, and we found ourselves also covered in this snow, which was still falling. I trudged with tens of thousands of people, I suppose, walking out of Lower Manhattan. It was a very bizarre scene, like again, out of a movie, people just walking in a daze as we walked up to Grand Central Station. Everyone was trying to call on the phone to tell your loved ones that you're okay. The Verizon telephone, the cell station had been in the Trade Center, so the phones didn't work. And the first call that I got, ironically, the first call that came through to my phone, probably when I was close to Canal Street, was my uncle and aunt in Jerusalem, asking if I was all right. They were living through the second Intifada. They were calling me to see if I was okay. In the days that followed, like everyone else, I think, who experienced the event, you ran over the event in your head, like a film, like the Zapruder film, thinking about all the things that happened, how it could have been different. What if I had taken the train that day? What if I had not gotten lost with my car and had ended up driving by the Trade Center just when the plane hit? What if, like one of my colleagues, I was walking on the plaza when bodies were falling? What if, like one of my other friends, a piece of the fuselage almost fell and hit me? What if I was in a building, like one of our neighbors who had his building in the Trade Center, in the financial center, excuse me, when a piece of the World Trade Center fell and took off the corner of the building and destroyed his office? Over and over and over, you go over these types of things. You have a tragedy, I'm sure, whether it's an accident or a health situation. You run that film in your head. Randomness of time. Thankfully, our lives are mostly routine. Most of us have fairly routine path that we follow. Baruch Hashem. When things happen that are extreme tragedy, you run the film. And we wonder how things could have been different. Why did this happen to us? Why was this so random? If we do that more often, I think if we do that for the good things, if we think back about all of the good things that happened in our life and run through that film, we'll appreciate that life has these good moments. The random moments come together and result in good things. And I think that's one lesson that I took from the horror that was that day. The other thing I think, as I thought about this event and connecting it to the Yamim Noraim, and you think about the randomness of time, and you think about how you stand on Rosh Hashanah, you stand on Yom Kippur, and ask Hashem to describe us in the book of life. You're faced with the contradiction. You're faced with the contradiction of we ask Hashem to control us, to guide us, but yet we want to control ourselves. We have free will. And there's much to be said about that from a philosophical and intellectual level. It's a debate that has raged in centuries. Which is right? The answer, of course, is both. And I think we take comfort from that. Both concepts are true. We have what I imagine is some Lahavdil partnership with Hashem. Hashem guides us. Hashem controls our lives. But yet we have the ability to change things, the ability to do tshuva. And we talk about changing our own lives on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We think about how we can make our lives different. When we think about a tragedy and a disaster, the Gemara tells us you're supposed to do tshuva when you hear about a disaster falling to other people as well. And the reason is that when we change our lives, we're able to change the rest of the world.